Hello and welcome to AgriFocus. We are live from the European Parliament here in Strasbourg in France as Taoiseach Micheál Martin addressed MEPs about Ireland's priorities for hosting the EU Presidency for the next 6 months. I'm joined on AgriFocus today by MEP Billy Kelleher with a number of things related to agriculture and particularly Ireland being focused on over the course of this week at the Parliament in Strasbourg. But first of all, let's talk about something that is very relevant to our listeners. And that, of course, is the Sustainable Livestock Strategy that the EU has decided to publish. Now, we covered some of the detail of it on Agriland already last week, but it seems today it's being published formally. And I suppose MEP Billy Kelleher, as someone who has always been an advocate for animal welfare, for livestock, for live exports and so on, and very much been involved in animal welfare issues in the European Parliament, what is the aim behind this particular strategy in terms of animal welfare and livestock sustainability, really?
Well, I mean, if you look at the numbers of livestock across Europe over the last 10 years, they've been consistently dropping. We now have a situation where, in bovines, for example, we are, 10% behind where we were in 2015. So there is quite a fall off in the number of people that are involved in agriculture, in livestock farming. And that in itself brings challenges. I mean, primarily livestock farming is something that can take place in, hostile terrain. That wouldn't be suitable for tillage and for other forms of agriculture. So it is a very efficient way of using, poorer lands, high lands, and lands that wouldn't be accessible to heavy machinery. And that in itself is an important food sustainability supply chain in terms of converting grass and other feed stuffs into protein. So a strategy was looked at in terms of how can we make livestock farming sustainable, how can we put it on a long-term sustainable trajectory, and also take into account, the need for us to have high protein base in the European Union. And then on top of that, of course, we also have the issue of animal welfare and making sure that there's no degradation of the environment as well on top of that. So it's bringing all those things together. So the publication of it, we await. And hopefully it will come forward with something that I believe has to happen. And that is that farmers can see a future in livestock farming. The best way to encourage intergenerational renewal, the best way to allow people to remain on land is if they are farming in a viable way. And of course, a lot of policy changes will have to come about in certain key areas around that. Obviously, the issue of animal welfare is one, but disease, for example, is another area where I believe that this livestock strategy will very much look at and making sure that there's proper funds in place to assist farmers in the context of disease eradication, but in the event of they losing a herd themselves because of a certain disease outbreak. So that there will be just some areas. On top of that, then we have to make sure that it is compatible with the environment and that we put schemes in place to ensure that farmers, particularly in the more difficult areas with tough terrain for farming, that they can feel that they can make a livelihood as well. And it's not just about farming itself. The difficulty that we have had, and we failed to sort of get this message across, farming is much more than just about the agricultural output as well. It is also about the impact that it has on the community around them. So if you have vibrant agricultural sectors in rural communities, you have a vibrant rural community. It sustains services. It might even increase demand for services. But without people involved in frontline farming, then populations drop and very quickly you have a reduction in services. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of undermining rural communities. So farming in itself is hugely important from the point of view of the individual farmers themselves, for food security and food supply, but on top of that then making sure that we have sustainable rural communities.
You mentioned profitability there, and certainly that's one element. There's a lot actually covered in this livestock strategy, but one of the elements ties in with generational renewal. In terms of profitability, a lot of livestock farmers across Europe are getting out of livestock farming, be it cattle, sheep, in some cases goats, if it's in a different member state. But how are we going to ensure that generational renewal unless we make it profitable for young people to get into farming now? And as you said there, in the more marginal land, of which we have some ourselves, we have hill farmers, we've coastal areas, we've wetlands that we can't farm on in Ireland in particular. How are we going to make it profitable from a policy point of view? But should it have to be a case of put your money where your mouth is as well? because sometimes you have to give a carrot to get people into this?
Yes, well, I think the first thing is we have to try and build a sustainable industry. So that means that there's a return on investment for farmers. So they go out, they purchase the product, they rear animals, they develop an enterprise, and there has to be a return on that investment. That's easier said than done in the sense that how do you interfere with the market to ensure there's a broad return. So that means a number of things. It means that if we are allowing products to be imported into the European Union, that they comply with the same standards that we expect farmers in the European Union to comply with. Otherwise, you're conferring advantage on products coming in from outside the European Union. So certainly equality of standards and making sure that there's a mirroring of standards. That would be one key area. Access to finance, another very significant barrier, particularly in that intergenerational challenge where you're going to have two families on the one farm, one retiring and the other coming into farming as well. That's another key area. But fundamentally, I also think that we have to have more observation of the food supply chain itself, and the costs incurred, the profits and where they go, because we have to try and make sure that there is a fair return to the farmer, and at the same time that the costs to the consumer are in accordance with basic market conditions. And at times, I wonder, is that the case? So I think there has to be a greater role for the food ombudsman, for example, and for having that ability to look into the food chain to see where costs are being incurred and where profits are being taken as well. Because once we lose the primary producers in these areas, very quickly it just undermines the broader capacity in those rural communities, and it undermines the broader rural community as well.
The European Parliament has passed new measures in terms of fertiliser, for example, a very high cost input for farming across Europe at the moment due to volatility, geopolitical volatility, and a lot of things going on everywhere in the world at the moment, every which way. But when we look at the CAP and the negotiation that is about to take place in relation to the MFF. Now, for those of you who don't know what the MFF is, basically it's the EU budget, of which CAP is a part of that. You have been here quite a while now as an MEP and you know how things work. Will you explain to our audience what the negotiations will entail, what it's really about? Are we looking at a situation where the European Parliament, the European Council and the European Commission negotiate and argue amongst themselves of what they want? Are we looking at party political groupings like Renew or EPP working against what they want? Or are we just looking geographically at countries arguing with each other? How is it going to work out that this family of 27 by the end of the year is going to agree a common budget?
Well, it's all of the above just mentioned. I mean, that is a difficulty that we have. It's very fragmented in terms of the view of how we fund Europe into the future. So, I mean, we talk about own resources, but the very much you mentioned own resources, which effectively would allow the European Union to have some capacity to raise funds itself. At the moment, the vast majority of monies that the European Union disperses across the European Union are ones that are, given by member states in national contributions. So countries are saying, well, we can't afford to give any more. But if you want to increase budgets and if you want to, enhance the capacity of the European budget, the money has to come from somewhere. And, I believe that we have to look at own resources. In other words, we have to allow the European Union other capabilities to raise revenue. Not necessarily through direct taxation, but certainly trying to find some way of allowing the European Union to expand its budget. Like, we expect the European Union to do an awful lot with a very small budget. It spends about, 180, 200 billion per annum up until recently. And bear in mind, that's for 450 million people. The Irish state spends about 140 billion for 4.5 million people. So, I mean, we clearly, have to accept, I believe, this stage. If we want fair budgets for the various programs, cohesion policy in some member states, the common agricultural policy, Horizon funding, for example, and the many other programs that we fund, if we don't expand the budget some way, well, then we're going to be in a situation where we'll be looking at cuts across all the big headline budgets. And that, in my view, is the wrong way to go. The idea of the European Union is one that I believe passionately in. And that means that citizens have to feel there's a stake in it that there's a reward of being a member of the European Union. So for rural communities, for peripheral communities, cohesion funds would have been very important. Interreg fundings would have been important in previous times. Horizon funding, for research and innovation. These are all vitally important components to allow the European Union to grow and to expand, but also to give citizens the confidence to know that being part of the European Union is a positive, both for their individualised but collectively for countries as well. So it's going to be difficult for the Irish government, and we're going to be right involved in these negotiations. Some countries are very clear that the budget must remain at 1.25% of GNI. Other countries are saying that that is even too much and they want to cut back the budget. But if you're talking about cuts of a budget, ultimately you have to identify where those cuts come from. And I would be concerned for, if we don't expand the budget, that it could fall in certain key areas that could undermine the common agricultural policy, for example. And that certainly would be something that we will be resisting. But in proposing budgets, you have to propose where you get the money and where it's going to be spent. And a lot of the people that are discussing these issues aren't willing to do that. They're either calling for more money, but they're not identifying where it will come from, or equally they're saying it should be cut, but then they're not saying, well, where are you going to cut it? So I think we need to have an honest debate. But the first thing we have to accept, in my view, is that the budget as it stands isn't sufficient for us to do what we need to do to make Europe safe, to make Europe more competitive, to provide resources for the programmes that are in place, the Common Agricultural Policy, cohesion funding, Interreg, Horizon, the entirety of what we fund at the moment. And that is definitely a place that the Irish government has to take strong leadership in to show that we can find a compromise that may not suit everybody, but will defend the most basic interest of the European Union, which is providing for its citizens.
And Billy, the Commissioner Michael McGrath, that is, also mentioned about the own resources in terms of getting an EU budget. But there are some countries that were previously net contributors that are no longer net contributors now. And, telling people to go around and dig in their pockets when Europe is already suffering a competitiveness crisis, really. Now it's trying to address it, but it's hard to know how quickly that will have an impact. What are people going to do if they just, refuse? And secondly, in terms of the impact that the negotiations will have for Irish citizens, you referenced there that people need to have a stake in Europe, that you feel passionately about Europe being the best place to be and to be part of this grouping. But what do you think your constituents, back in Ireland will think, or any of them, in fact, if we go back to Ireland at the end of December and there's an MFF agreed and it's really taken a hard hit to agriculture and agricultural or rural funding? I mean, the people in Ireland will certainly feel a little hard done by and that they're not part of the stake then at that stage. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I certainly believe that the sum of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts when you look at the European Union. So by having a budget allocated to various programmes across Europe, we get a greater value, greater bang for our buck, because you can use European Union funds as leverage. You can leverage off them as well. So we have done that very effectively in certain key areas. So, in some programs you can have matching funding, for example, with member states, not in common agricultural policy, but in other areas. Equally, when a state has provided money, it can leverage that money as well in terms of borrowing, etc. So there is potential and flexibility, I think, if we're imaginative. But I still think the key point is that if you cut budgets, it means that you cut provision of services or support to citizens. And when we're trying to build solidarity across Europe, and we're trying to build a union where citizens see a real tangible benefit to be part of this, well, then they have to be able to see supports at some way on the ground in terms of their community or directly in terms of cohesion funding or the common agricultural policy. And I mean, when you look at Europe, I mean, it is by any credible stretch one of the great success stories since the Second World War in terms of sustainable peace on the continent, a rising living standards for our citizens, improvements in health outcomes, in educational outcomes. We have achieved an awful lot, but you cannot ever be complacent when it comes to being, in a union like the European Union. You always have to try and advance because there are others that are trying to undermine it from within and outside, and equally the whole issue of competitiveness. So I'm still hopeful that there's enough goodwill in the Council and Member States to realise that if we cut too much, we undermine what we've built. And I believe that this is worth continuing to build, maintain and mind.
MEP Billy Kelleher, thank you very much for joining us on AgriFocus today. That's all we have time for on this episode of the programme. If you like this particular programme from Strasbourg, please do rate and review us. You can find us on all the podcast platforms and indeed on the Agriland app and the Agriland website. Until next time, goodbye and take care.